So my name is Manny. I own a civic and political gathering and event space in San Francisco called Manny's. And this is really why we built this space. It was to create opportunities for people to get informed, get involved, learn about what is happening. And learning, we learn about things for multiple purposes. One is just for our own edification. Another is for action. And I think today, this conversation, this kind of learning, I see this really as a way to steel ourselves, to make it through the day and be a little bit less afraid and be able to kind of spread proper messaging. But this is a very scary and dark time. And so I really hope at the end of this conversation, we can all walk away knowing more, but also hopefully feeling like we are on a bit of more sure footing with that knowledge. Again, maybe a little bit of courage and of calm, hopefully, with some context. And so with that, I want to welcome our amazing guests tonight. And Rachel, thank you for doing this on such short notice. Rachel Rizzo is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Her research focuses on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. She was also the director of programs at the Truman National Security Project and the Truman Fellows. And before that, she was a Robert Bosch Fellow in Berlin. She worked at Human Rights Watch in Berlin. And so her expertise is multifaceted. She has a deep understanding of German politics, the transatlantic relationship, NATO, and has been studying this issue in particular for a very long time. So I'm very thankful to that. And also there's an ask in the chat to turn on transcript. So Tomas, if you don't mind turning on transcription, so those who would like transcription can have it. All right, Rachel, I think that's a good enough introduction for me. I'm really glad we're doing this. I don't know about you, but I, like many Americans and probably people all around the world, got home last night and saw the headlines and basically freaked out and was like, what the hell does this mean for the world? What does this mean for me? So I hand the stage to you to kind of open this up and give us a little bit of understanding and context. And again, thank you very much.
Absolutely. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to spend some time talking to folks about what's going on. It's been a really intense 24 hours, as I mentioned. I think how I want to do this is, obviously start with a quick primer on what is happening and what led us here, and then go a little bit into the US response and Europe's response during the Q&A and what this might mean going forward. I think an open Q&A is probably the most interesting for everyone, so we can spend most of the time talking about that. But I do think a quick historical primer of like, how do we get here is really important, because I think even for me, it's confusing to come to terms with. So as everyone has been watching on TV, reading in the news, as we've seen over the last 24 hours, this is basically a full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine. For those of us who study Europe, who have been watching Russia amass troops, tanks on the Ukrainian border over the last few months, this is the worst case scenario that we were worried about. And I don't want to be a catastrophist. I want to be measured in how I talk about this. But this event right now, what we are witnessing is history in the making. It is war on the European continent for the first time since World War II. And I think this is going to fundamentally change borders, politics, relationships going forward. I think it's hard to overstate just how consequential what is happening is. But I think how and why we're here is a more complicated explanation. And there isn't an answer that's clear cut or black and white. There rarely is in these matters. But the best I can do is say that this comes down to history. This comes down to historical grievances and the belief by Putin that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This is a comment that he made in the 2000s, and this fundamentally drives much, if not all, of his thinking. You've probably heard a lot recently about whether or not Putin is a rational or irrational actor. Would he do this? Would he invade? What's he doing? When it comes to rationality, the only way I think you can effectively make that call or that measurement is if the actor you're referring to, Putin in this case, is coming at a situation from the same fundamental set of truths and beliefs as you. For the United States, those fundamentals are a right to self-determination, a US-led international order, the respect of international borders. Putin doesn't believe in any of these things because he fundamentally believes that the world as it is shaped today was shaped to the detriment of Russia and the former Soviet Union. So for him, what is happening right now makes perfect sense. It is rational. It is a correction of history. For us, it looks pretty much irrational and insane. So that's a quick, somewhat sort of dark primer. So what we've seen over the last few months is Russia basically start to amass troops on the Ukrainian border, both from the Russia side and from Belarus, led by Alexander Lukashenko, who is a close ally of Putin, or who's partner of Putin. In Belarus, those troops were sent in under the guise of hosting military exercises with Belarus. And in Russia's Western military district, he just said he had no plans to invade. It's his territory. He can do what he wants. The West is being alarmist. Obviously, the US and Europe haven't seen it that way. In the US, our intel agencies have been warning for months that we could expect an invasion. Putin has decided to invade, and that we could see a repeat of 2014 or worse. Now, if you remember in 2014, Russia sent these little green men, basically Russian troops with no markings on them to say that they were Russian, into the Ukrainian territory of Crimea to foment unrest and then eventually occupy it. It's been occupied by Russia ever since. Of course, again, this was under the guise of protecting Russia and Russian speakers who were, according to Putin, under threat from the Ukrainian government. Obviously, that's not true. He's a master at misinformation and disinformation. He also supported pro-Russia separatist leaders in the Ukrainian Eastern Donbas region since 2014 as well, specifically two areas called Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, Putin hasn't been public about this support over the last 8 years. He's denied it. It's turned into this simmering conflict for 8 years where almost 15,000 people have died. All of this setting the stage completely changed over the last 72 hours. And it's really what has set us on the collision course that we've seen come to a head. Earlier this week, he officially recognized these two separatist republics in Eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic, as independent states, and signed a friendship agreement with their pro-Russian leaders. Pro-Russian. I'm putting this in quotation because, as a reminder, this is Ukrainian territory. These are not independent states. And then Putin decided to send in Russian peacekeepers into these regions under the guise of protecting, again, ethnic Russians, and calling on Ukraine to lay down their arms. Now, Ukraine is not the aggressor here. What Putin started doing this week was creating a pretext for further invasion, blaming Ukraine for a series of explosions and attempted attacks of sabotage. So it looks like Russia engineers a pretext to invade, saying that Ukraine has done all these things and that they need to respond. This is the false flag attack we're all worried about. He blames Kiev and then can come in and say he's trying to keep the peace. Earlier yesterday, we started getting intel reports that there was a full-on blitz of Ukraine that was happen at 4 a.m. Ukraine time. And again, like I mentioned before, this has been what people have been warning about for months. And it did happen. The blitz on Kiev started before dawn. We saw columns of tanks and armored vehicles entering Ukraine from Belarus. We saw bombs on Kiev, outside of Kiev at the airport, the taking of airports around the country, an amphibious assault on Odessa, the seizure of the Chernobyl power plant. And this is continuing now. The question is, why? Why is Putin doing this? What are his aims? Again, like I mentioned, this does come down to historical grievances. But the question is, like, really, where do we go from here? It's looking like he wants eventually President Zelensky of Ukraine to leave. He probably wants to install a new pro-Russian government in Kiev, recognize Crimea as Russian territory, abandon pursuit of NATO EU membership for Ukraine, provide autonomy for the Donbas region, and equal rights for Russian and Ukrainian language. But again, this is all very fast moving. Things are changing by the hour. There was, again, an assault on an airport outside of Kiev. We thought that the Russians were going to take it. The Ukrainians fought back and engaged and retook the airport. But this is a fundamentally, I think, history happening in the making. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the West responds, continues to respond, and what happens over the coming days and weeks. So I'll stop there and give it over to you, Manny.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask a bunch of rapid fire questions. Yeah. And then for everyone else, please type your questions into the Q&A box. Some people are already typing them in, and then I'll just try to get through them as well. So there is no truth to this claim that Ukraine was attacking ethnic Russians in the two regions that you mentioned, Donbass and Lufthansa, I think it was.
The Donbass region, yeah.
Yeah, so that was not happening, right? And these are ethnic. There are a lot of ethnic Russians in this area that are separate from ethnic Ukrainians. They're two separate ethnic groups, and it's an area with a lot of ethnic Russians that is in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, and remember that Ukraine is a post-Soviet state. I mean, this was part of the Soviet Union. So when I talk about these historical grievances, Putin doesn't really think that Ukraine is a real country. To bluntly, I mean, he sees that he is reconstituting in a way the former power of the Soviet Union, and how that ends up playing out for him is going to be really interesting. I think he thought this was going to be easier. I think conventionally that the Russians do outmatch the Ukrainians when it comes to military conventional means. But I think that the Ukrainians have been fighting harder than the Russians expected. And so that could shift Putin's calculus in the coming days. But this idea that he is coming in to protect Russian speakers or protect ethnic Russians, this is part of the disinformation and misinformation, the machine that the Kremlin is so good at. And I do want to be clear, though, it's so important to separate like Russia as a country and its people with the government. This is not something that the Russian people want. You've seen protests break out across Russia over.
I was going to ask: is that are there protests in the country happening right now?
Absolutely, and this is really scary for people, because we've seen over 1,000 people be arrested throughout Russia over the last 24 hours for protesting these moves. Major actors in Russian theater, in Russian TV, in Russian movies who show up on Russian state media a lot of the time have spoken out against this. That's not easy for them because of this state apparatus, because of Putin's machine. So we could see more arrests. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens, but this isn't the same as just like going to the White House and protesting. This is people's lives that they are putting on the line to protest these moves.
Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of historical questions. Then I want to get to some stuff happening right now in the region, and then get to a couple of what we think this means for the future. So Ukraine is not in NATO, right? No. But did it want to be in NATO and was rejected? Why is it not why is it not part of NATO?
So this has been a really interesting question, especially over the last few months. I have to rewind it back to 2008. NATO had a major summit back in 2008, and the country of Ukraine and the country of Georgia were effectively told, yes, eventually you will be NATO members, but we're not going to give you a timeline. We're not sure when that actually will happen. For reasons that may go beyond the scope of this conversation, the French and the Germans did not want Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO. This is seen as provocative toward Russia. It's adding more countries under the US security guarantee, potentially. Remember, the most important part of NATO is the mutual defense clause. This idea that an attack against one is an attack against all. And basically that means that if there is a member of NATO, we are obligated by treaty to defend them should they be attacked or should their sovereignty be threatened. The only time that NATO's mutual defense clause has ever been invoked in NATO's history was the day after 9/11, September 12th, 2001, when our allies came to our aid. So the worry is that if you expand NATO, and it has seen rounds of expansion in the past, but if you expand it to Georgia and Russia, you will again be adding countries under the mutual defense clause and be provoking Putin. That's
I see.
Yeah.
So what has our relationship historically been, our military relationship been with Ukraine? Do we have military bases in and around Ukraine? Do we have kind of our own military agreement with them if they were to get attacked? I know that, you know, we have US troops sent to Eastern Europe, we have bases in Germany, but historically, what has been our kind of military relationship with Ukraine?
We are not obligated by any treaty to defend Ukraine. Since the 2014 illegal invasion of Crimea, we have sent them aid. We have sent them defensive weapons. There's been a call by a lot of people in the DC policy-making community, especially those who watch Russia closely, saying we need to send Ukraine offensive weapons. That hasn't happened yet. So we don't have troops there. We don't have military there. We do have around 40,000 troops still present in Germany, stationed there permanently. We also have troops on a rotational basis in Poland and the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. All 4 of those.
What are they doing in these countries?
So all 4 of those countries share a border with Russia. Remember, Russia has this little blip of land on the Baltic Sea called Kaliningrad. So Poland shares a border with them there. We are reinforcing NATO's eastern flank. We are deterring Russia from having any ideas on Eastern Europe. Basically, we have troops stationed on the Eastern Front as a tripwire, basically as a deterrent effect. There's no like fighting on that Eastern Front or anything like that, but we are there on a rotational basis to sort of hold down the fort.
Got it. My only other question on historical context is you mentioned that Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that the greatest tragedy in modern times was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Could you make the argument that, so do you feel like based on that, his goals are really just to put the Soviet Union back together, or has he said things in the past that indicate that he's interested in doing more than that? You know, the kind of scenario you often see in scary action movies where they want to, you know, take over the world or, you know, attack America on our home turf. Like, what has he said? What has the Russian military said or done that might help us understand how far they're trying to go with this?
So right now, I don't see any conventional or nuclear threat to the United States, either here or any of our territories abroad. I don't think that this is a line that Putin would cross. If you saw Biden's speech today, he made it very clear that we will defend every inch of our territory and NATO members' territory if necessary. And so I really don't think that that is a line that Putin would cross. I also don't think he would outwardly threaten the Baltic states. These are post-Soviet countries, but they are squarely in the West. They are members of the European Union. They are members of NATO. I also don't think this is a line that Putin would cross. It's the countries that are sort of in the gray area that I think are a problem, and this is namely Ukraine. I think that's the main focus now. I think.
Are there any others?
You saw his relationship with Belarus really deepen over the last year and a half. Belarus.
What about Chechnya?
Chechnya is a Russian territory in the North Caucasus. So it's right above the country of Georgia. There have been Chechen separatists and Chechen terrorist organizations in the past, but this is a territory that is firmly part of Russia. It's Russian territory. It's not something that Putin needs to retake or anything, because it's never limited.
Okay, so what's going on right now on the ground in Ukraine? You mentioned the shelling. You mentioned there's fighting happening about capturing the airports. How are the Ukrainians responding? we're seeing reports of Ukrainians, pulling their money out of banks and trying to get out of town, drive or fly out of the country. What is happening in the country itself? Is there a Ukrainian army that is currently fighting the Russian army? Can you help us understand what's actually going on the ground?
Yeah, they are really putting up a fight. The Ukrainian military, since the illegal invasion of Crimea in 2014, has been preparing for this. Obviously, they're outmatched by Russia, which has one of, if not the largest military in the world, but besides the United States and maybe China. It also is armed with nukes. Remember, I mean, that's a big part of this. Not that they're going to be used. I don't think they will. But part of the reason that Russia can wield the kind of power that it does is because of that, because it has a massive nuclear arsenal. It's probably a different conversation for a different day, but it's really important. President Zelensky of Ukraine gave a very impassioned speech yesterday. It was one for the history books. It was basically, if you invade, you will see our faces, you will not see our backs. We are going to fight. You've seen Ukrainians fighting all day, especially in the Black Sea, for example, this Russian amphibious assault on Odessa, and this small island with border guards of it in the Black Sea, who were all killed today by the Russian military. The Ukrainians are fighting. They will continue to fight. Ukrainians, some are fleeing the country. Moldova, over 4,000 refugees in the last 24 hours. But depending on how the next 72 hours go, what happens with the city of Kiev, what happens with Mariupol, Odessa, the eastern part of the country, we'll have to watch that closely. It's hard to know now what the outcome is going to be.
So you kind of mentioned this in your opening remarks, but if the city of Kiev is taken over by Russian troops, what does that mean for the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Well, I guess it goes into what Putin's aims are. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different scenarios you could potentially see playing out. You could see a scenario where Zelensky is removed from government, where supporters of Zelensky that are unlikely to support a Russian puppet regime are potentially killed. I know that's not something happy to think about, but I think it could be a reality. And then they install a pro-Russian government, and people just sort of live under that government. But remember, Ukrainians aren't pro-Russia. This is a country that has just invaded them. So the idea that they're going to hold Kiev and I mean, it's really hard to think about. What you could see also happening is Russia basically taking over the east half of the country and pushing Ukrainians into the what would probably be the new capital of Lviv. Again, these are just speculations. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, which is why this is such a confusing time. Like we didn't think that Putin would invade and try to take Kiev, because it seems like such an irrational move, but that's what we're seeing happening.
So let's talk about how the world has reacted. There's been kind of international condemnation all the way up to heavy sanctions. I listened to President Biden's speech today, and he laid out the gravity of these sanctions. I think one of the banks has 30% of all of Russian assets was not able to do business. He mentioned also that they wouldn't be able to do business in multiple currencies, including yen. And so what has been the global reaction been to kind of try to stop this? And do you think it's enough?
So I think what's important is that at this point, we are not instituting sanctions against Russia to deter them. We are instituting sanctions to punish them and make sure that they feel the pain. I don't think that there is any set of sanctions, at least right now in the short term, that would make Putin say, whoa, this isn't what I was expecting. We're done. We're rolling the tanks back. You win. I just don't see that happening. I think this is been a very calculated move. So the idea is that we want to squeeze the Russian economy. So basically the US a couple of days ago did a first round of sanctions after Putin recognized those two independent republics. The EU followed suit, the UK followed suit, and then today, yet another round of sanctions that go really, really hard. They hit all of the major Russian banks. They hit members of the Russian Duma, the parliament. They hit Russian oligarchs and their families, which is something that has historically been not off limits, but we haven't really gone there. We haven't gone so far as to remove Russia from the international SWIFT system. I think that the US would be okay with that, but the Europeans have sort of
what does that mean?
The international SWIFT system is a banking system that basically matches orders together and facilitates financial transactions. So if you remove Russia from it and don't let them use it, it basically makes it a lot harder for them to pursue major financial transactions. But I will say, if you freeze their banks, they can't use the banks anyway. That's sort of a way around that.
Sorry, I have to ask, as you continue to explain these sanctions, I mean, you said yourself that the Russian public, for the most part, is against this. Is the idea with these sanctions that it would outrage the public enough to foment some kind of, pressure on Putin, or is it really being targeted at his cronies and oligarchs and kind of the wealth class?
So this is the really hard part about sanctions, is that you don't want to punish the people who aren't responsible for this invasion. Putin held a emergency meeting today with his group of oligarchs, basically. And I think there were a couple aims here. The first was maybe to reassure them a bit, but the second was to remind them that their future is tied up with Putin staying in power. He does this to ensure his regime's survival, to ensure that there is no dissent within his inner ranks. And so while these oligarchs are hit by these sanctions, Putin has done a very good job over the last years, months, basically sort of sanction proofing his economy, right? Energy prices have been really high, which have benefited the Russian economy. He has a massive amount of reserves. I think I can't remember the exact amount, but it's enough to float the economy for a while. But I do think that these sanctions are going to hurt, and they're meant to hurt. One of the major ones that I think is really important, that probably a lot of people have read about, is the fact that Germany canceled this new pipeline that was supposed to run from Russia under the Baltic Sea to Germany to deliver natural gas. This has been
okay. So tell us about that. So it had this contract with Russia. It's now canceled that contract, so it's no longer, or is it just putting it on hold?
Yeah. So basically, this pipeline called Nord Stream 2, that does suggest the existence of Nord Stream 1, which there is. But this new pipeline has been in the works for years, and it was finished a few months ago. This has been a huge irritant to the transatlantic partners, to the Biden administration. Some Republican lawmakers Jacob, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is still supplying gas, you're right. Republican lawmakers have held up some of Biden's ambassadorial nominees over Nord Stream 2, the desire for the US to sanction companies enough that it would be canceled. And Germany has been sort of on the fence about it. They've been unclear about whether they would cancel Nord Stream 2, this project, in the event of a Russian escalation. And we did see 2 days ago, the certification process for the pipeline is on hold. So Nord Stream 2 is not happening anytime soon.
Why have they been hesitant to do it? Is it really, didn't we say we would supply them with the oil they needed, or is it because they're low on oil, or what's their hesitancy?
This goes into a lot of in-depth details about the intersection of Germany with Russia. Germany doesn't have the same relationship with Russia as the United States does. And it has always sort of seen itself as this bridge between the West and Russia. It also is known as having some pro-Russian historical figures, one of whom, former chancellor, who now sits on the board of directors for Gazprom, which is in charge of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So this is a pretty complicated relationship. They also didn't want to upset the business community. Germany has a brand new chancellor, didn't want to come in and upset the business community. Also didn't want to potentially plunge Germany into a energy crisis in the middle of winter. If you cut off, if you cancel Nord Stream 2 and then Russia decides to cancel energy imports into Europe, you could see major energy spikes or energy price spikes. I think the important thing is to remember that this is a mutually dependent relationship. Europe still gets 40% of its energy supplies from Russia, and Russia in turn gets money from those sales. So this is a,
right. Right. So you've said that sanctions are not really being used to prevent war, or not reliably, at least, not really. And so not really being used to deter Russia from engaging in warlike activities. I mean, they're in there, they're with tanks, they're attacking airports. So what's next? I mean, we're getting a lot of questions about this. Like, what is the likelihood that this just continues to escalate? Maybe can you give us a couple scenarios and maybe what you might think? I know you're not a psychic, but what you might think with, all of your understanding of this region are kind of the most likely scenarios. It sounds like it's all bad, but there's, I guess, a best and a worst case from here on out. Can you kind of help us understand what might happen?
What I could see, I don't see this escalating to, I mean, I know there's been a lot of like nuclear saber rattling. The French Minister of Defense today was like, remember, NATO's a nuclear alliance. Putin was like, don't stop what we're like, don't try to stop us. Like, we'll punish you in ways you've never seen before. So there has been like this talk about potential nukes. I would reassure everyone on this call that I don't think there's any chance that it would go that way. What I do think,
that is reassuring. I definitely went to the corner store today and was like, do I need to worry about San Francisco being, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's this sort of interesting theory, like this stability instability paradox, where like if two major actors have nukes, it does allow for more conventional fighting and more conflict below that level, right? Because there's almost this ceiling that no people will dare reach. And so they feel like they can sort of be a little bit more aggressive. And that's what we're seeing in this case, I think. What I think could end up happening is I think that we are going to see this as a long, sort of drawn out conflict, not with like huge conventional fighting for months or even years. But I think, if in the next 72 hours, we'll have a better sense of what Putin's aims are here. If he gets Kiev and demilitarizes Ukraine, which is his goal, I think we could see this sort of turn into a Russian puppet state where they install a pro-Russian leader. And then the question becomes, really, what is the future of Ukraine? What does its borders look like? I mean, obviously, the international community wouldn't recognize a pro-Russian installed government in Ukraine. There would probably be a shadow puppet government, a Ukrainian government that's in Lviv that says that they still govern the whole country. So I could see this turning into a protracted, very political conflict. The hope is that the West, that NATO, the United States, that the hope is that we stay unified in our response and keep the pressure on and ensure that Putin knows that what is happening won't go unpunished.
Got it. Okay. And I think that is, I want to get to a bunch of the audience questions. We have 25 minutes left, and I do want to thank you for all the generosity with your time. So let me first get into this Q&A, and then we'll try to get into some of the other questions. Okay, here we go.
I see there's a question here. Saying anyone not named Putin claiming to know whether the Russians will use nukes is guessing. I mean, yeah, but I really would caution getting into the nuclear scenarios here. Remember, there is mutually assured destruction. It's this wouldn't be in Putin's interest. Again, he's not really a rational actor, but I would caution against that a little bit.
Okay, there's a bunch of questions about the connections here to Nazism and Hitler. Colin Gallagher asks, what are Russians supposed to think when they hear people marching in Kiev in honor of Stepan Bandera, who was a Nazi? Then there's also a question about, can Rachel speak to Putin's claim that this invasion is an attempt to denazify Ukraine? I think, yes, Putin Ukraine Nazi sympathizers, but then also the Ukrainian government tweeted something today that showed Putin as hit with Hitler. So what is the Hitler Nazi thing happening? And can you give us a little bit of historical context?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one for me. I don't understand this as well as some like real Russia watchers. I mean, Zelensky is Jewish. Like calling for the denazification of a country with a Jewish leader. I mean, this is just, it goes to show the fact that the way that Putin is thinking about this is part of this misinformation and disinformation spin that is just simply not true. Russian speakers and Russians have they have just as equal of rights as Ukrainian speakers. I mean, people in this country speak both languages. They learn both languages. I mean, this is a tough one for me. And I don't have a clear answer for it because it's something that I'm trying to understand myself.
Okay, it does seem kind of strange. And some of these questions you may not be able to answer, but there have been reports apparently that Zelensky has ordered all men 18 to 65 to stay within the country. Is that true?
I mean, he declared martial law. He called up the reserves. If that means that every man between 18 and 65 has to stay, I mean, that definitely could be true. I do know that there are a lot of Ukrainians who are now enlisting and are like ready to fight for the country. I don't honestly know if that's in response to Zelensky saying like it was required that they have to say, but I do know that a lot of people are joining and are fighting.
Got it. Kathy asks about UN peacekeepers. Where are the UN peacekeepers, and would Putin dare fire on them if they showed up? And why is the UN not sent in peacekeepers, or has it?
So what is interesting here, the Blitz on Ukraine, this happened during a UN Security Council meeting. This is the biggest, I mean, I hate to say this, but it's one of the biggest like middle fingers to the West and to the international community that you have seen in decades. This is saying to the UN on behalf of Putin, you can't do anything. You're not going to do anything. So look, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop me? I mean, it was brazen. It was bold. I mean, it's something that I don't think we'll see again in our lifetime, like watching the UN Security Council meeting live while also watching bombs being dropped on Ukrainian cities. It was just wild. I don't know what the requirement is for UN peacekeepers, if this has to be like a UN officially sanctioned peacekeeping mission. I don't think that is happening. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but again, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Colin asked how far you think the NATO alliance is willing to go to prevent Ukraine from falling. There's been a bunch of sanctions, but is that it? Do you think we're going to see anything further from the NATO alliance to prevent Ukraine from falling?
To be completely honest, I don't.
I mean, yeah, that's why you're here.
I don't think that there is a scenario where we see NATO allies. I don't think we're going to see NATO troops on the ground. There is a scenario where I could imagine more defensive weapons, maybe offensive weapons being supplied to the Ukrainians, because at least in that scenario, there's like plausible deniability. It's the Ukrainians that are the ones that are fighting. It's not the US, it's not a European country. But because we are not, and this is just like the harsh way to say it, because we're not obligated by treaty to defend Ukraine, I don't see a scenario that NATO will send in troops to do that.
Okay.
But
Pramila,
NATO is hosting a major meeting tomorrow. So let's see what happens. There are multiple countries who have called for official consultations, but let's see what happens.
Okay, Pramila asked a good question, which is about, if we knew that this was, going to be an issue in the future, why was Ukraine not provided, she says tanks sufficient to keep surrounding key cities at bay, to prevent something like this from happening for the future. Why was Ukraine not militarized in a more aggressive way to prepare for this very thing from happening?
So this is going to be a conversation that is had for a long time. There were people within the US government, and there have been since 2014, really, that have called for a more aggressive militarization of Ukraine, not just defensive weapons, offensive weapons, javelins. I mean, we've wanted to send, there have been a group of people who have been very vocal about the need to more forcefully arm Ukraine. Unfortunately, as the United States has shifted our focus to the Indo-Pacific region, as we've tried to get the Europeans to be more responsible for their own neighborhood, for their own security, there is less, as we wind it down in Afghanistan, there has been less of an appetite in the US to get more involved militarily in this conflict. There is a worry of escalation if US military equipment is used. Defensive weapons are, if a country is attacking, you can use weapons to defend yourself. Offensive weapons are if you were doing an offensive attack on another country, there just isn't the appetite in the US for that.
Got it. Sophia wants to know, she read that Ukraine had agreed to give up nuclear weapons after the end of the Soviet Union in exchange for some sort of security agreement. What is the status of this agreement, and what is Sophia mentioning?
So this is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, but this is a good thing to remember. Ukraine actually never really they didn't have the codes to these nuclear weapons. Remember, this is right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This was a post-Soviet state that still had Soviet nukes on it, but the codes to the weapons were basically in Moscow. So it's not like the Ukrainians could have ever actually used them, but we did say if you demilitarize, there is a protection mechanism there. So they basically gave up the nukes. The details of the Budapest Memorandum, I'd have to go in and read it. I don't know exactly what the language is and how it, or if it requires by treaty an obligation to defend Ukraine, but I know that that's not something that the United States is planning to do. But that's a really interesting point, because yes, there were nuclear weapons involved in this in 1994.
Adar wants to know how much of this is Putin's greed for the energy market.
How much is greed?
Who might be motivated by greed for the energy market in some respect? Is this invasion connected to energy in some way?
So I don't think this event, I mean, it's not caused by one thing. I do think the major driver here are these historical grievances. Remember, if the energy market crashes, if we decrease Putin's energy exports, that's really going to sting. Of course, there's potentially China he could just turn to sell them. It's a whole other conversation. So yeah, I mean, this is partially could be driven by that, but it's a whole amalgamation of issues. The NATO question, the historical grievance, the nostalgia for the Soviet Union, the idea that Russia is a great power and thus it should be treated as such. Mother Russia. There's a lot there.
I think the name of this person is Anne or Ain. They ask, is there a possibility that this could turn into a quagmire for Russia like Afghanistan was? Long-term occupation, insurgency, local ground fights. I mean, that was a disaster that will eventually lead them to pull out. Is it possible that there's similar forces at play here that would turn this into a long-term quagmire for Russia?
Yes. Short answer, yes, that's a possibility.
All right, Colin asks, won't sanctions hurt ordinary American people who are already paying increased costs for gas and energy more than they would hurt Vladimir Putin?
Yes, that's a worry too. I'm gonna link one thing here from The Economist. It's a really good, I know that, oh gosh, I have to find this. It's a really good article on the risks of sanctions and what they might mean. Here they go. what could happen with for ordinary citizens. But the short answer is yeah, ordinary Americans, everyday Americans could feel the squeeze on that. I just put it in the chat, so if anyone wants to read it, it's really good.
Cool. Everyone check that out and click on it. I mean, I have to just ask as a follow-up, it feels like when people are talking about quote unquote what to do, there really are only two options that are being presented. One is military conflict and sanctions. What are we missing? I mean, what other tools does President Biden and NATO have at its disposal?
I mean, I think that you can provide support for Ukrainian refugees. I think that's going to be really important. As I mentioned, Moldova has already seen over 4,000 over the last 24 hours. There's an expectation that there will be more. Oh, sorry, did I not send this to everyone? Oh, I sent it to the panelists, so sorry. Hold on one second, everyone. You know what I think is really interesting here are, I mean, look at Russian oligarchs. These guys have money around the entire world. Like there are shadow companies, there's money laundering. These guys are rich because the West lets them be rich. If we can like really make Russian oligarchs feel the pain, that's another thing we can do. There's a whole lot of questions here about, you know, kleptocracy and money laundering and where they're hiding their money. I mean, there's a lot there. One of the Russian oligarchs, Abramovich, literally owns FC Chelsea, I think is what it is. I mean, these guys they have billions and billions and billions of dollars around the world. Like, let's try to do something about that.
Got it. Felicia asks, what about the whole cyber war dimension? I believe that Ukrainians are very sophisticated with technology. Can they hurt Russia in this regard? Could this be the first kind of major cyber war, you know, volley back and forth?
Sure. We've already seen a bunch of cyber attacks happen over the last few months on the Ukrainian government. You could potentially see the energy field as being on the receiving end of Russian cyber attacks. So yeah, I mean, I do think that's possible. And I saw this tweet, like, I think it was from Anonymous, who said that they're now the Russian government is now an enemy, so now they're going to get hacked. So yeah, I mean, I do think that cyber is going to be a major aspect of this, but it always has been.
Okay, another two questions from an anonymous person that I think are good. One is, what are your thoughts on the role and goal of the 7,000 American troops that the Pentagon is sending to Europe? What is that actually going to do? And then where do China and Turkey fit in? What are they doing?
So we already have troops in Europe. Look, the point of sending more is to reassure allies and deter Russia from thinking about doing anything on a NATO country. This comprises an armored brigade combat team, if I'm not mistaken, and its enablers. So, I mean, 7,000 troops, this is a tripwire. Like, we're not sending in a major, offensive of U.S. weapons of like 40,000 troops. This is a deterrent effect. A very small number of Americans has a very great deterrent effect on the Eastern Front. I think that's important to note. Turkey's a member of NATO, so that's something to remember. Turkey also shares a coast of the Black Sea with Russia too, so that gets pretty confusing and complicated quickly. But Russia and Turkey are frenemies. Remember, yes, Turkey has bought the Russian S-400 missile system, but at the same time, Turkish drones are what helped Azerbaijan win against Armenia in the war last summer. So they're not super close as people would paint them. China's an issue here. I mean, obviously, a lot of people bring in the Taiwan scenario to this conversation. I think there are limits to that, but it's an interesting point. Obviously, China has said that this is a U.S. fomented crisis. So
got it. There's a lot of questions, Rachel, in the chat about Trump versus Biden and what did Trump do? There's a question about the non-proliferation treaty that Trump did not renew, and also some questions about, did Biden's kind of handling of the Afghanistan pullout have an effect here? What is your understanding about the difference in how they both approach Russia and how there might be some causality here?
So
in 2 minutes.
yeah, I was thinking that there could be some movement here on strategic stability talks with Russia and the United States, like limiting nuclear weapons. Yes, Trump allowed basically the last treaty that was limiting the use of nuclear weapons to expire. And so that's dangerous. So if things get to a point where there's open dialogue again, I could see nuclear weapons and strategic stability being a topic of that conversation. In short, yeah, I'm sure Afghanistan. I don't think that's what caused this. I don't think anyone is saying that, but I do think Putin is probably looking from Moscow, from the Kremlin, and seeing relative American decline in his eyes, heavy polarization. Questioning US institutions, Fox News, Tucker Carlson saying, like, why have you been taught to hate Putin? You should like Putin. A really messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. So a lot of these factor into this decision.
Okay, Larry Best, I want a question that maybe provides a little bit of a positive scenario. He says this may be wishful thinking, but is it possible that if sanctions are severe enough, that the majority of Russians whose leaders are the targets of Putin's wrath gain power and overthrow Putin? Is there any feeling that like maybe he went too far and this combination of sanctions and protests and what's going on might finally result in his overthrow, or is that just wishful thinking?
I don't think it's going to result in his overthrow. He has pretty much like coup-proofed himself, right? He's tied all of the oligarchs to him. He's basically, there's no room for dissent in his security cabinet. If I were you, I would go back and watch his Security Council meeting from Monday of this week. It's totally bonkers.
Wait, this is whose Security Council meeting? Can you say that again?
Putin's Security Council meeting. I mean, you really watch him go around the room and ask for everyone's opinion. There is no room for dissent here. I mean, he has solidified himself as the center of Russian power. But there is a growing movement. I think this is with a lot of authoritarian governments. This idea that like young people, they don't want to live in an authoritarian state, right? I mean, the whole deal with Putin has been, you let me do my thing, you let me take care of Russia, and you are going to be better off for it. When the people are not better off for it, the question is what then happens. So if he has miscalculated here, if he's overplayed his hand and he starts to see more dissent, not necessarily in his ranks, but amongst the Russian people, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Also, remember, he's old. Like his time is coming to an end as a leader, and he wants to solidify his legacy. This is all a part of that.
Questions from Ian Magruder, who is the progenitor of this talk. He is the one who texted me at 7 a.m. while I was at the gym and suggested that I reach out to you. So Ian, I want to publicly thank you for helping make this happen. Without you, it wouldn't have. He asked if the U.S. mandated disclosure of beneficial ownership of all real estate. Beneficial ownership is that thing where people have LLCs that hide who actually owns and benefits from profits, and all those like people that buy up apartments and never live in them. In SF, New York, and Miami. Would this significantly reveal Russian oligarchs' hidden money in the United States, and would it make a difference?
Absolutely, yes.
But apparently David Cameron wanted to do this, and we balked at making commitments for this. Is that just about protecting our own money?
Probably, but it's going to be interesting to see if this is on the table. I think it should be.
Okay, an anonymous question. Which local news sources do you recommend for following the situation on the ground? It's a good question. I feel like there's a lot of there are reports that people say that, but if you just wanted to stay informed, where would you go right now?
Okay, so I'm going to post some of these into the chat. I follow the Kiev Post. So here, I'm putting these on Twitter just because that's where I spend a lot of my time, obviously. There are also like really good military analysts who know, yes, Bellingcat, May, you're totally right. Bellingcat is great. There's also this guy, Robert Lee, who is following what's happening on the ground, like hour by hour. There's also some really good analysts. This guy, Michael Kaufman at CNA, who I follow. This guy, Sam Cherub at the Rand Corporation. But yeah, I follow the Kiev Post, and then I'd have to go in and look through like specific names of journalists, but start with the Kiev Post, and you can probably get more information from there.
Okay, and should people follow you? Are you posting about this and updating folks on your socials, or are you kind of more behind the scenes?
Oh yeah, no, I'm posting like crazy. I'll put my Twitter account on here now if anyone wants it.
Amazing. And then Kelly, I'm just going through the chat. I went through all the Q&A questions practically, but Kelly, you asked a question in the chat. I'm trying to find it as well. Gosh, you guys are really active in the chat, so I'm having a little bit. Oh, disinformation. Da, 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 da. Oh, hoping for a quick analysis. Is there a more serendipitous coincidence with Russia's aggression and invasion and the rise of white supremacy groups around us here? And also wondering the timing of US culture wars and all this being in concert with the astroturfing, false flag truckers, combos. Oh my God, yeah, it does seem like all this crazy shit is happening at the same time. The question is, do you think that there's a coincidence between Russian aggression and invasion and maybe seeing some of these, the false flag trucker combos in like Ottawa and Shasta and the white supremacy movements growing in the United States?
Yeah. I mean, like I've mentioned, I mean, Russia is very good. The Kremlin is very good at fomenting misinformation and disinformation. So like while they probably didn't create the trucker convoy, I haven't been following it that closely. They benefit from instability. Remember, one of the biggest threats to Russia today is a unified, powerful West, a powerful Europe, a powerful United States. And for them, fomenting discord in our society is to their advantage. And I almost feel bad saying to their advantage because it makes it sound like I'm talking about Russia as a whole. I'm talking about the Kremlin. I'm talking about Putin. And so I want to be clear about that. But yeah,
Okay.
like one of the biggest beneficiaries to Donald Trump's presidency and the discord that he sown within the United States was Putin, for sure.
So I guess I just want to, we have 3 minutes left and I want to keep this on time. There were a lot of questions and we got to it, but I just want to put a fine point on it about how to, and the president said this in his speech today, that we want to make sure that Russia is not emboldened. I was interviewed by the Associated Press and they asked me how I felt. And I said, I couldn't help but feel in my mind that this might have been what it felt like when the Germans invaded the Sudetenland, saying that they had a right to it because there were ethnic Germans there. And people kind of said, we don't want to get into a full-scale war, and there are ethnic Germans there. So, one, do you think this apples to apples connection to Germany's, taking over, starting with land that they quote unquote had a claim to, and then the rest are unfair? And two, if you don't think they're unfair, then what this fear of having Vladimir Putin be emboldened to do something else. Maybe he then does take over the Baltic states. Maybe he goes to other countries. I mean, kind of what would you say to people who are worried about those two things? And that was a long question. That's my last one.
Yeah, no, I think what I would say is that, if for me, I consider myself a progressive Democrat. And so, thinking about like the militarization of US foreign policy and the militarization of Europe is kind of tough sometimes. But to not embolden Putin, we have to show that we will fight for our values, that we will fight for democracy. And that's I think what is so important to me. This doesn't come down to how to not embolden Putin. This comes down to how to embolden good actors within our societies, people who want like more equal societies, who want to decrease pay inequality, decrease income inequality, take part in these racial reckonings that are happening, supporting underrepresented communities. I mean, all of this Putin sees as a threat, right? So when I think of not emboldening him, I think of empowering the right actors in our own societies.
Amazing. And then I guess, sorry, the last question, and I put a link already in the LA Times, and this actually came from Ian. It had a list of 3 Ukrainian organizations in California that they look and support. But if people want to help, if people feel like, okay, I'm watching the news, but what can I do? What would you suggest people actually do? Is there anything we can do?
I mean, I think that I was talking to Ian about this earlier too. I think you put that link from the LA Times for these Ukrainian organizations. I would probably start there.
I'm going to put it at the bottom of the chat because y'all are so active. You put, you have so many things to say, which I love. So let me put it at the bottom of the chat as well. Oh God. Nope. Let me just do this. So I'm going to put the LA Times article at the bottom of the chat, and no one posts for like 2 seconds, so that if people actually want to click on it, they can. And then will also say, because I have to, because I'm a small business owner and I'm trying to keep it alive, that if anyone here wants to support us in our work and help us continue to do stuff like this, where I woke up in the morning, I figured we needed to do something, and we spent the day getting this together and bring people like Rachel to you to answer your questions. We had a full hour chock full of questions. Please become a Manny's sponsor. You'll get an email with the link. You can also just go to welcometomannys.com. If you're not already a sponsor, it's how we are able to do the work that we do. It's $36 or more a month. And so please become a sponsor if you can afford it. Please support Ukrainian refugees when the moment comes, obviously. We're not there yet. This is an active situation. I'm reaching out to other experts as well over the coming weeks. So, we may do more events. So just stay tuned for that. All of our programming is at welcometomannys.com. To all of you who donated for this event, I thank you very much for supporting our work. And finally, and I think it goes without saying, thank you to Rachel Rizzo, now our resident NATO European politics expert. I hope I can call on you. We can all call on you more for questions. This has been super informative, and I really appreciate it. And I'll just close by saying, a restless nation woke up today, right? I mean, this is like, as Rachel said, and as we've seen in the news, what has happened over the last 24 hours is truly historic. And I'm sending all of you strength and comfort. It's important in this time that we hold each other close, that we stay calm, we stay informed, and we do everything we can to try to understand what is happening. But it is, in fact, a terrible moment in history. And I just want to acknowledge that for all of you. And though I can't see your faces, and though I'm here in my little closet at the corner of 16th and Valencia, I'm sending you support and hoping for a better day tomorrow. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. And thank you again, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye.